A Stormy Night. By Fuboku Kosakai.
Part 1. One night in late November, when autumn was at its height, the Ghost Story Club held its regular meeting on the second floor of a certain restaurant. Its 10 members, 5 men and 5 women, met once a month. In imitation of the old game of 100 tales, their number was 1/10 of 100. That evening F had brought an original copy of Ryushido's supplementary tales for children, which he said he had recently acquired, and read aloud every story that looked interesting. One piece, entitled A Warning Against Lust in the Presence of Monsters, unexpectedly set everyone talking. Its plot was commonplace enough for a ghost story. A man named Kiheiji was traveling when darkness suddenly fell in an open field. Seeing the light of a house far ahead, he made his way toward it and found a beautiful young woman alone. A lover of women, Kiheiji was immediately drawn to her and brazenly made advances. She yielded with surprising ease, and the two shared a dubious night together. When Kiheiji awoke at midnight, however, the figure beside him was no beauty but a hideous monster. With a cry he fled, and the creature pursued him. At last he shook it off and reached a village, where he heard revelry inside a house. Relieved, he peered in, hoping to take refuge there, only to discover a gathering of goblins. They shouted that excellent prey had arrived and rushed after him. Kiheiji ran wildly once more and fortunately escaped. Entering another village, he heard a rooster and hurried on in delight, only for a white-haired crone with the face of a demon to spring from behind a tree, cry that Kiheiji was a rare prize, and embrace him. He groaned and fainted. Yet the first half of the tale inspired a lively discussion among the members. What would it feel like, they wondered, if the man or woman who had shared one's bed were transformed into a grotesque monster by the time one awoke? Naturally, none of them had experienced such a thing, so they could offer only imaginary theories. "I would run away just as Kiheiji did," said H, a newspaper reporter. "No, I am ashamed to say I think my legs would give way beneath me," said B, a scholar of ukiyo-e. "I would bite it," said Miss S, a teacher of Nagata singing. "What spirit you have," said M, a physician of about 40. "I think most men would faint." "Good heavens," said Miss S in surprise. "Are men really such cowards?" Her tone was edged with irony. "Fainting is surely a little extreme," H objected. "That is because neither Miss S nor H has considered the circumstances leading up to such an event," the physician M replied gravely. "Monsters and ghosts appear because fear or guilt already exists in the heart. If a phenomenon like the one we have described occurred before someone in such a disturbed state, that person would certainly faint. Indeed, fainting would not be the worst of it. Sometimes a person goes mad." "Surely madness is going too far," said Miss S. "No. It is true." "Then, doctor, do you know an actual case of that kind?" Miss S pressed him shrewdly. "I cannot say that I do not," the physician replied. He lit a cigarette and smiled suggestively. At once the members joined in urging him to tell the story. "Very well. I shall tell it to you." With that, M took a sip of tea. Part 2.
As you probably know, a physician may appear to practice a free profession, but in fact he is subject to considerable restraint. The difficulty of earning a living is common to every occupation, but a physician also faces troubles arising from the restrictive provisions of medical and criminal law. You may suppose that I resent the law because I wish to commit crimes. Nothing could be further from the truth. I mean the anguish that arises when criminal law and humanity cannot be reconciled. At first glance such a conflict may seem impossible, but it does occur. An abstract explanation would be difficult to follow, so I shall give you a real example, one that also concerns the ghostly subject of this evening. I had been practicing as a specialist in venereal disease for 2 years when I married. I was 25 and my wife was 21. Even now, with gray beginning to show in my hair, I remain fond of ghost stories and detective fiction. You can imagine how adventurous I was then. My wife was equally daring. We were so much alike that we once discussed becoming motion picture actors together. The Japanese film industry was still primitive in those days and could never have fulfilled our ambitions, so naturally nothing came of the idea. We now have 5 children, and my wife has lost her taste for adventure entirely. Only I retain a little of mine. About 6 months after our marriage, the novelty of married life had begun to fade. At least, 2 people as fond of adventure as we were could not help feeling a certain restlessness. Just then a man of 25 or 26 came to consult me. My examination showed the first stage of syphilis. When I told him, he said, "Doctor, I must marry in 3 months. Please cure me before then." The moment I heard this, I replied, "That would be reckless. You must postpone the marriage for at least a year. Otherwise you will infect your bride." I gave him this warning, but he answered, "There are circumstances that make postponement impossible. You must find some way." He pleaded insistently, but this was the one request for which nothing could be done. When I told him so, he said, "Then there is no help for it. I shall marry as I am." His words were full of reckless despair. A chill went through me. My face changed as I carefully explained that infecting an innocent bride with a dreadful disease would be a cowardly and inhumane act, and that whatever the circumstances, a real man would postpone the marriage. Instead of listening, he lost his temper and challenged me. A doctor, he said, should treat his patients in silence and mind his own business. His manner angered me in turn. "If that is your attitude," I told him, "I too have a course open to me. For humanity's sake, I shall tell the bride the truth." This enraged him still further. He had graduated from the law faculty of a certain university and evidently knew the law well. He flung back a parting threat: if I exposed another person's secret, I would violate the criminal code, and I had better be prepared for the consequences. Then he marched out. Ladies and gentlemen, the marriage of people infected with syphilis was not treated as a major social question in Japan at that time, but I could not stop thinking of the unfortunate bride. The criminal code did indeed punish a physician who disclosed without cause a person's secret learned through professional work. Yet infecting an innocent bride was no crime, while preventing that infection would make me the criminal. How could I not be troubled? I had no wish to break the law by revealing the man's secret, so I privately confided my dilemma to my wife. She sympathized deeply and declared that saving the young woman was my duty. But how could we save her without violating the law? We discussed every possibility, yet of course no good method presented itself. At the very least, we had to discover the identity of the woman he intended to marry. After making inquiries, we learned that the man was to be adopted as a son-in-law by an old family in a certain district. To our amazement, although he had told me the marriage was 3 months away, he married after only 3 weeks. The family he entered was a wealthy household named Kato. Their residence was not enormous, but it dated from the days of the shogunate and stood amid extensive gardens. The daughter, Tomoe, was a beautiful girl of 19. The adopted husband was named Nobuyuki. He had plainly entered the Kato family for its fortune, and the reason he could not postpone the marriage seems to have been nothing more than his fear that another man would be chosen in his place. His spirit was sordid, and his body was tainted with disease. His arrival was a calamity for the Kato household and a still greater tragedy for innocent Tomoe. She had been sheltered in the strictest sense, knew nothing of the world, and devoted herself wholly to her husband. Perhaps the elderly Katos relaxed after obtaining a son-in-law, or perhaps it was mere coincidence, but both died within 6 months of Tomoe's marriage. For Tomoe it was the greatest possible misfortune, for Nobuyuki, an unexpected stroke of luck. After losing his adoptive parents, he left the company where he had worked and settled into an idle life at home. You can scarcely imagine that the Kato household would prosper under such conditions. Anyone could foresee some dark fate descending upon it. And so it did. The hand of a terrible destiny first seized the innocent Tomoe. Just as I had warned Nobuyuki, she contracted his dreadful disease. An elderly maid who had been cherished by the former master still served the household. Nobuyuki found her troublesome in every respect and dismissed her soon after his adoptive parents died, replacing her with a young servant. The new girl left before a month had passed. After that, every maid who came departed quickly, some within a week. The reason emerged later: Nobuyuki had made improper advances to them all. This was partly the result of his lecherous nature and partly because Tomoe's beauty was fading day by day under the ravages of that terrible disease. Do you know the miserable appearance of a patient in the second or third stage of syphilis? About 6 months after infection, eruptions appear on the face and across the body. The lips turn pale, and the inside of the mouth becomes raw like a split pomegranate. For a woman, the most terrible symptom is the loss of hair in great clumps. Each stroke of the comb brings it down, not in a light scattering but in handfuls. You may know the passage from the Jiruri version of the ghost story of Yatsuya, in which the heroine Oiiwa is poisoned, her face suddenly swells, and her hair falls out. Her hair disordered by bitter suffering, the loosened strands at her temples torment her. From the drawer of the dressing stand she takes a boxwood comb, grieving over the ruin of her changed body. She draws the comb through the tangles of her heart, and 1,000 strands remain caught in it. Unable to understand, she lifts it once more, the more she combs, the more hair leaves her brow, until she gathers it in both hands and stares. A person afflicted with syphilis may truly come to look exactly like Oiiwa. Consider it. Innocent Tomoe Kato had been made into another Oiiwa by her husband, another Iemon. Could any circumstances be more fitting for a dreadful, ghostly event? And now, ladies and gentlemen, we come to the true substance of my tale. Part 3. If an ordinary husband saw his wife reduced by illness to such a pitiable condition, he would naturally take her to a doctor long before the disease became so advanced. Yet Nobuyuki, whether we call him heartless, cruel, or something worse, never allowed Tomoe to receive medical care. A doctor would immediately diagnose syphilis, and his wife would learn that he had infected her. Even a docile woman might react unpredictably on discovering the truth. A physician might advise her and help her seek a divorce. Fearing that, he simply abandoned her to the disease. Tomoe, who knew nothing, resigned herself to misfortune and endured each day as it came. In time Nobuyuki found even the sight of her repellent. He might have gone out to escape that feeling, but he feared she would consult a doctor during his absence. He therefore stayed at home, where sexual frustration drove him to prey upon the maids. Once fate begins to torment a person, it seems never satisfied until it has dragged its victim to the very bottom. Poor Tomoe was no exception. At last the syphilis attacked her brain and caused mental disturbance. Such a condition could have been cured quickly by proper treatment, but she had never once seen a physician, and her illness worsened daily. She was also pregnant, and pregnancy itself can make a woman more vulnerable to mental disorder, so every condition worked against her. At first she fell into profound depression and repeatedly attempted suicide. Even Nobuyuki was alarmed enough to keep watch over her day and night. During this crisis another maid was hired. Her name was Sawa. She was attractive, looked like a daughter of a respectable family, seemed 1 or 2 years older than Tomoe, and possessed remarkable presence of mind. Before long, Nobuyuki was completely captivated by her. This servant would ultimately cause his ruin. He had grown weary of his wife, and now a woman far more worldly than Tomoe appeared before him. You can probably imagine what followed. Every previous maid had fled as soon as Nobuyuki approached her, but Sawa not only stayed, she seemed to show him a degree of affection. His heart was thrown into turmoil, and his passion for her grew fiercer by the day. Despite her disturbed mind, Tomoe apparently sensed Nobuyuki's feelings for Sawa. In fits of violent jealousy, she often seized Sawa by the neck and struck her. Sawa seemed to have some purpose of her own, for she merely smiled and never complained that the work was painful or the house unbearable. Seeing this, Nobuyuki hated Tomoe still more and sympathized with Sawa. At last he declared that Tomoe should be confined in the storehouse. Sawa objected at first but eventually obeyed, and together they shut Tomoe inside. Sawa nevertheless cared for her kindly. She kept the key, brought Tomoe's meals, and cleaned the storehouse herself. Nobuyuki never visited his wife once after her confinement. Locking a suicidal person inside a storehouse was extremely dangerous, but Nobuyuki was so consumed by Sawa that he seems to have hoped Tomoe would eventually kill herself. Fate is deeply ironic. Tomoe's condition, initially depressive, shifted into a state of excitement as the illness advanced, perhaps in part because her pregnancy had progressed. Far from attempting suicide, she became extraordinarily cheerful and could sometimes be heard singing inside the storehouse. The garden was large enough that no outsider heard her. In fact, no one but Nobuyuki and Sawa knew that Tomoe was imprisoned in the storehouse attached to the house. With Tomoe confined there, Nobuyuki and Sawa were alone in the spacious house. As you might expect, he pursued Sawa relentlessly. Yet although she showed him affection, she absolutely refused to give herself to him. His frustration mounted daily. At length he tried to resort to force. Sawa then made a firm declaration: as long as his wife remained alive, she would never submit to his wishes. What course would Nobuyuki, maddened by desire, take after hearing that? It scarcely needs to be said. He would rid himself of his wife. One night, while sharing Nobuyuki's evening drinks, Sawa understood from his words and the look in his eyes that he intended to murder Tomoe. She regretted what she had said and resolved to keep the strictest watch. Part 4. One night a terrible storm struck the city. Rain that had begun in the evening fell in torrents, and the wind raged with the roar of a lion. Such a night can drive even a healthy mind into an abnormal state. Nobuyuki drank cup after cup with Sawa. When he was thoroughly intoxicated, he suddenly said he was going to visit Tomoe and demanded the key to the storehouse. Sawa tried again and again to stop him, but he would not listen. She offered to accompany him, and he refused that as well. With no alternative, she gave him the key and huddled in the empty house, listening to the dreadful storm. After a while Nobuyuki came running back, his face transformed. "Sawa, Tomoe has hanged herself," he said, without even extinguishing his lantern. With a shriek, Sawa fainted and fell flat on her back. Nobuyuki panicked and ran for water, which he poured into her mouth. She remained unconscious for more than 2 hours. At last her eyes opened. She sat bolt upright, pointed to one corner of the room, and cried. "Look! Your wife!" She covered her face. Even Nobuyuki seemed startled, but he answered. "Nonsense! There is no one there." "No, no. I saw her clearly just now. Your wife stood there with her hair flying loose." "That is impossible." "Then please go and look inside the storehouse once more." Nobuyuki was plainly reluctant, but Sawa pleaded so insistently that he had no choice. Once again he lit the lantern and went to inspect the storehouse. The storm grew fiercer than ever. After a time Nobuyuki returned, pale as earth. The hand holding the lantern trembled violently, and Sawa knew that something extraordinary had happened. "What is wrong?" she asked. Nobuyuki merely stared at her face. "Sir, what has happened?" Sawa asked again. For some time Nobuyuki had worn the dull, drowsy expression of a patient under morphine, yet now naked terror showed through that sleepy face. The truth is, Tomoe's body has vanished. Nobuyuki spoke in a voice that seemed not of this world. Sawa shrieked and fainted again on the spot. Who could blame her? This was certain proof that Tomoe's corpse had become a ghost. This time, for some reason, Nobuyuki brought no water. He watched Sawa's unconscious figure with a smile and drank repeatedly. Presently he lifted her, carried her to the bedroom, quickly spread out a mattress, and laid her upon it. He sat beside her, staring with moist eyes that shone with desire. Then, inexplicably, drowsiness overcame him. He reached toward Sawa's body, collapsed beside her, and fell asleep. Perhaps the ghost had placed him under a spell. Several hours later Nobuyuki awoke. Dawn had not yet come, though the storm had weakened a little. His intoxication seemed to have passed. He raised his head and looked around in bewilderment. Then his hand touched something cold. He turned toward it and recoiled. Ladies and gentlemen. Sawa, who should have been lying beside him, had somehow become the corpse of a baby girl less than a foot long. Worse still, the skin over the infant's entire body looked as though it had been scalded with boiling water. Truly, this was a ghost's terrible revenge. He he he. Ooh hoo hoo. Ah ha 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 ha. Nobuyuki suddenly lifted the infant's corpse and ran around the room, uttering that hideous laughter. The unbroken succession of horrors had finally driven him mad. At that moment the storm rose again, and the electric bulb lighting the room swung violently. Part 5. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the ghostly portion of my tale. Needless to say, Nobuyuki did not go mad merely because Sawa seemed to have changed into the dreadful infant. During the storm he had strangled Tomoe and arranged her body to look as though she had hanged herself. The principal cause of his madness was the torment of conscience that followed. You will probably wish to hear the truth behind the haunting, so I shall explain it briefly. The whole affair was a performance devised by my adventurous wife and me. As you may already have guessed, Sawa, the maid who captivated Nobuyuki, was my wife. Determined to save Tomoe, we investigated and discovered both her infection and the rapid succession of maids. My wife entered the house in service, though by then Tomoe's illness was far advanced. It would have been simple to carry her away for treatment, but we wanted to make Nobuyuki repent fully, so we waited for the right moment. My wife and I met secretly many times to arrange our plan. When she finally confirmed that Nobuyuki intended to kill Tomoe, I began visiting the Kato house in secret every night to stand guard. Then came the night of the storm. Certain that something would happen, I watched the storehouse. Nobuyuki appeared, suddenly strangled Tomoe with a hand towel, removed the cord from her, and hung her body from a beam to make the death look like suicide. Then he fled. Had he used a knife, I would have rushed out to stop him. Since he chose strangulation, I waited in terror for my moment. As soon as he left, I lowered Tomoe and performed artificial respiration. She soon began breathing again, and I carried her to a room my wife and I had prepared. Before long, Tomoe went into labor. The child was stillborn and horribly deformed by syphilis. Tomoe's strangulation had deprived the fetus of air as well, and at about 7 months it could not survive. Meanwhile, my wife had already mixed a sleeping drug into the wine. Nobuyuki fell asleep before he could assault her while she pretended to be unconscious. We then placed the newborn body beside him. Every part of our performance depended upon opportunity. If anything went wrong, I was to rush in, but my wife handled matters so skillfully that fortunately I never had to show myself. We intended only to terrify Nobuyuki into repentance. The medicine proved a little too effective, and he lost his mind. After receiving treatment for syphilis, Tomoe recovered completely from her insanity, but Nobuyuki never regained his reason. When one considers that he had in fact killed Tomoe, perhaps it was no more than the punishment he deserved. Still, Though we were young and reckless, my wife and I carried our adventure very far indeed. In any case, ladies and gentlemen, my long story must surely have bored you.
The Japanese Mystery Library. Classic mysteries from Japan in English. Subscribe to hear the next story.